Today we're going to continue with discussing aspects of how government grew at the beginning of the 20th century. And there are some important aspects to that story that Leach discusses in Land of Desire. You might want to take a look at his discussion of the Children's Bureau, the U.S. Children's Bureau, and also the growth of the post office at this time. But I thought I would start by showing you two short films that were done in 1905 or 1906. The second one was certainly done in 1906. It'll be obvious why I say that. Shot in San Francisco. The first one is really a great little film. Somebody put a camera on the front of a cable car going down Market Street. So it's 9 minutes of going down Market Street from Van Ness down to the ferry building. It was shot either at the end of September 1905 or the end of March 1906. So it was shot either 6 months or a week or two before the earthquake, the great earthquake. I think if you just look at it, you'll get a sense of how things are changing, but also what the norm used to be. Okay, good. And then the second film is a short film, also done on Market Street, a few days after the earthquake and fire. So it is the same scene that the streetcar was viewing, but after the disaster occurred. And so let's just watch the films. The first film, it's important just to look at the various things that are going on in it. Okay, come on. Go. We're going. So if you notice, you should see that there are no street lines. There's no crosswalks. There's also, it's not required to be on either the left or the right side of the street. You go wherever you see a space for yourself and someone will open it up. Pedestrians cross whenever they can. Now, San Francisco at this time was a much smaller city than, well, not much smaller, but somewhat smaller than it is today, maybe 500,000 people. But it was the commercial and banking capital for the entire West Coast. So it was one of the most important cities in the country and indeed probably in the world. California was one of the major providers of food for England, Australia, Japan, as well as numerous other countries. The previous year they had just started to issue licenses for cars, but not driver's licenses yet. Anyone could drive, yeah, if you could figure out how to make it move. You can see, now this is probably, at this point, it isn't like a Hollywood production, so they couldn't close down the street and only have the things that the director wanted to have. It was mostly what you would see if you were going down Market Street at, I think it's at noon, on a busy commercial work day. But there are actually more cars than there should be. So probably they encourage people who own cars to come down to Market Street and show off. There are some islands for the streetcars, cable cars, but oftentimes the pedestrians just waited in the middle of the street. And if you're crossing, you might cross a quarter of the way, wait till more traffic passes, cross the rest of the way. From our point of view, there were no traffic rules or regulations, and indeed there weren't any whatsoever at this point, other than informal. Should also take a look at the clothes that people are wearing, because that's interesting. From our point of view, it's completely chaotic. From the point of view of the people at the time, no. It made perfect sense if 5 miles an hour was kind of the maximum that anybody was going to go. Yeah, you have a question?
Yeah, what time of year was
it? It was either the end of September or the end of March. They can tell that by looking at the time on the clock at the ferry building and then the angle of the light. So it has to be either the end of September of 1905 or the end of March 1906. So September could still well be warm. End of March, possibly. Starting to get warm again.
How many traffic accidents were there?
Pardon?
How many accidents were there?
Well, accidents were a problem even in the 19th century. A lot of people died being run over by cable cars and streetcars. What the kids are doing, they're probably showing off for the camera, but that's in fact what people did at that time. When cars first appeared, or because had been typical that you could hop onto the back of somebody's wagon or buggy if there was space to carry you. And, the custom was the owner wouldn't complain. So people figured the same thing for cars. Not realizing that even though cars might seldom go above 20 miles an hour at this point, that's still fast enough to get killed if you get thrown off. But at this point, this is all, everyone's still operating in a world which is very local. You go onto the street, all you need to do is catch the eye of the person who might be coming your way or might be where you want to go. And you two essentially negotiate at that moment what's going to happen. There's no sweat about it. By 1915, essentially the basis of modern traffic laws and traffic regulations have been developed. They were developed by the same man. His last name was Keeney. I will bring a slide with his picture. He developed basically the framework for automobile traffic and for air traffic. He died in an airplane crash in 1916, which is probably appropriate for someone who really enjoyed going fast, fast, fast in metal objects. And then in the 1920s, the federal government got involved and developed a national set of standards for traffic. So by 1930, everything that we basically are used to today was pretty much developed and in place. And you can imagine the revolution that would involve for people. Because previously you went onto the street and you just figured out what to do. Now you had a set of rules that you had to follow all the time. There was no such thing as stopping for a red light in 1905. By 1920, that was something that people had learned to do. and that you had better do it, and if you saw a red light, you don't play around. There's no negotiating. In order to make the transition from a street where things are going 2 to 5 miles an hour to a street where things could be going up to 35 or 40 miles an hour, you have to give up a lot of individual control to a governing body. It didn't have to be the federal government, but it had to be some government, state or local perhaps. Somebody had to set the rules and then be in a position to enforce the rules. I'll put a link to this film on the website, so you can. It's on YouTube, so you can watch it again if you want to. I think it's really amusing. So, okay, here we are, possibly a couple of weeks later, at the latest 6 months later. The film is deteriorated, so that adds to the ghostliness of the situation. But if you think back, I mean, the Market Street previously was lined with really extraordinary buildings that belonged to stores and corporations. It was a situation where you could say there was public chaos, but private, really striking private order. But here the city is demolished, or a good third of the city was destroyed. The earthquake itself did not really do much damage. It was a very strong earthquake, but builders in California, after several major earthquakes in the 1860s, had learned how to construct their buildings so they would better resist earthquakes, and insurance companies helped them along in case they had some hesitations about whether they should do it. There were a few injuries from the earthquake, but nobody was killed. The injuries were primarily from things like plaster falling on people's heads and things like that. The damage, the destruction of the city, and the deaths that ensued as part of that was entirely the result of the fire. Why did the fire destroy so much? Because the fire departments had determined in order to stop the fire where it had started from spreading, they had to create a empty zone. They had to destroy a whole range of buildings so that would be wide enough for the fire not to be able to jump out of its starting point, which was next to North Beach, into the main part of the city. The problem was that the section they wanted destroyed, which is now Barbary Coast down in San Francisco, was was liquor warehouses owned by major liquor companies. The liquor warehouses said, "You're not going to destroy it." They sent their private guards, their private army, who started firing at the fire department in order to protect their buildings. Their buildings were saved. In fact, that's why that section of the city, remains. But it was a small section of the city, and